Distinguished Speaker Series. I'm David Crossley. I'm president of Houston Tomorrow, and we've done, I guess, about 8 or 9 of these events so far. They are funded. We're so happy that they are funded by the Anchorage Foundation of Texas for 2 years in a row, and we have had a very high level of distinguished speakers appearing here, and we are going to have a lot of fun with our distinguished speaker tonight. Terrific speaker and an energetic guy. I want to, before we start the actual program, I want to mention some other things that are happening. I don't know, I hope all of you are aware that Blueprint Houston will have another Citizens Congress this Saturday, 9 to 1, George R. Brown Auditorium on E, in Exhibit Room E, from 9 to 1, there's no charge. You just have to come out. We'll have all the mayoral candidates will be there, and you'll have a chance to tell them that you want to have a general plan for the future of the city. So I hope everybody will go to blueprinthouston.org and let us know you're coming, and then just show up and do your thing. Additionally, we will have the Houston Food Policy Work Group. How many of you came to the food conference we had last year? Interesting, yeah. Well, that's sort of moving into something. It's actually getting ready to be something. This Food Policy Work Group is working towards setting up a regional food policy council that will probably be, if we can pull it off pretty soon, will be the first in the nation. That will be a region-wide policy group that will work to figure out how we're going to feed ourselves as the world changes. Then on October 28th, the Livable Houston Initiative, which is every 4th Wednesday, over at HGAC, been doing that a long, long time. Our speaker will be Molly Scarborough, who's a senior planner with the City of Austin, who's going to talk about all the transit-oriented development that's going on in Austin, in spite of the fact there's no transit yet. But lots of development anticipating. And then a biggie on October 30th, Friday night, Andres Duane, who's one of the sort of the godfather of New Urbanism and one of the founders of the Congress for New Urbanism, and a guy who's now impassioned about agricultural urbanism. We'll come here to talk about that. So, and that will be free, and you will, if you're on our list, you'll find out about that. And then we always want to remind you that on November 3rd is Election Day, so don't forget to go out and vote. Tonight, we're going to have, this is a kind of exciting moment, because not only do we have John Norquist coming to talk to us tonight, but we have now formed in Houston a CNU-Houston organizing committee. There are steps that you take, and we are pretty close to actually being a chapter. So I want to ask Patrick Van Pelt, who's been sort of trying to make this happen for about 2 years here, come up and say a couple of words. And Andrew Burris.
Well, hello everyone, we're glad to see everybody here. I just want to welcome you on behalf of CNU-Houston, and also a special thanks to David Crossley and Houston Tomorrow for putting all this together. Like I said, we're really glad to see everybody here tonight. David mentioned we're forming a CNU-Houston chapter. The steps you go through are an interest group, an organizing committee, and then you're a full chapter. And we just finished the process of going from an interest group to an organizing committee. And now we're working on full chapter. Full chapter has a little bit more paperwork, but we've been getting ahead of ourselves on that side, so we're really ready to go. The hurdle for an interest group to an organizing committee was 20 members, and we passed that a few weeks ago. And the next step is 50 members, which I think we probably have hit tonight. But we also would love to see everybody here be just really impressed by this speech and decide to join CNU tonight, so we can have 100 members at the end of the night. That would be great. So. If you decide to join, we do have one special members-only event happening tomorrow morning, and we'll have Patrick tell us more about that.
I think one of the oldest forms of bribery in human culture has been to give someone something to eat. So for members, there's an exclusive breakfast tomorrow with Mayor John Norquist at Tacos A Go-Go, which is I'm going to act like we're a real heavy urban transit town. It's on the Red Line at the Ensemble HCC stop in Midtown. The address is 3704 Main Street, and we're going to meet around 7:45 for breakfast. Tacos A Go-Go. It's a neat, funky place. If you haven't been there, please come by and think about joining the chapter. It's very exciting, and if you want to come and join us for breakfast and just try it on for size, I'll vouch for you. It's free. Thanks.
And so we'll go to John. What did I do? Hello, yes. John Norquist, who has had several careers, and one of them was as the mayor of Milwaukee, where he transformed. And I'm telling you, if you haven't been to Milwaukee recently, you need to go. It's a fabulous place. What's happened along the river happened during his watch, and it's really cool. And he actually was one of those great mayors who got a freeway torn down and moved. But now he's leading this enormous worldwide organization, the Congress for the New Urbanism, on the same path, really, that he was walking down in Milwaukee. And I hope you all will get it, that this is where we're all going in America now, and so let's see how good it can be. John Norquist.
Okay. Andrew Burleson, could you come forward, please? Thank you, David, by the way. This is more paperwork for you. Good luck with it. All right, the Congress for the New Urbanism. Some of you are already familiar with it. Some of you are members. But the Congress for the New Urbanism was started in 1993 in Alexandria, Virginia. The idea was to promote urbanism. And the reason the word new was picked was mostly because urbanism was very stigmatized. It was just at the end of that era where everybody's talking about people moving away from the city. Not that cities have completely rebounded. I mean, there's Detroit, for example, which is still in that pattern. But the founders of CNU, and I was at the first meeting, but I wasn't one of the insiders that was organizing it. I think they really felt that urbanism was so stigmatized in the American mind that they had to put the word new in front of it. And if you were trying to figure out what was new about new urbanism, maybe there's a little bit of new in the fact that it tries to deal with the automobile, which other forms of urbanism before that had never really tried to do in terms of parking, relationship to multimodal transit and all that sort of thing. So there's a few new things, but mostly it's old. And it's mostly trying to retrieve, to revive urbanism that had been washed away for a variety of reasons. Mostly good intentions, but bad outcomes. And so we ended up with sprawl. This is not in Houston, but it certainly could be. The typical intersection, this is actually Brookfield, Wisconsin, outside of Milwaukee. And there's two things I want you to see in this picture. One is the separate use zoning, which was, that's where the office is in its own pod, and then on the other side of the street, and I have a pointer. There's the retail, and up in the top, you can't see it very well, but there's housing, apartments just by themselves with parking lots and berms around them. And then next to that, single family. And then the single family is all separated by price point. So everything is highly separate. And the separate use zoning was really a creation of the progressive movement. It was sort of the last gasp before the progressive movement died. They sort of did their really good ideas early, and their worst idea they saved for the very end. And their idea was to clean up the cities by getting rid of the clutter, uncomplicating cities, and just sort of spreading them out. And you'll remember Jacob Ries's book, How the Other Half Lives, and with all the photographs of the tenements on the Lower East Side of New York. And it was that they were trying to get rid of. And, I can understand that. But turning the city into a place that's livable for families and children and all that sort of thing doesn't mean you have to destroy the city. So it was a gross overreaction. And that created sprawl. The other thing I want you to see in this picture are the streets. And Houston's very familiar with this form. And traditionally throughout human history, streets have had three functions: movement, economic, and social. And so as a street would enter an urban area, then it would become a place where commerce occurred. If you were moving through ancient Rome, you would have been accosted by hawkers trying to sell you bread or something even worse, wine or whatever, illicit products, legal products, whatever. But that, you'd have the market, the bazaar, all these things would form around the street, and they also have a social function. But what has happened in America is that the federal government and the various state DOTs have pretty much focused all their money just on roads that move, that are from movement only. And so no walking, no selling merchandise. You have to get off the road if you want to do anything other than just drive. So that's been a pretty profound change, and I'll get back to that a little bit later. And here's what it replaced, something that's never done consciously until just recently. We've started to see more of it. But this is a 19th century neighborhood in Chicago, Wicker Park. Those of you familiar with Chicago, the Damon stop on the Blue Line, North Avenue, Damon Avenue, and Milwaukee Avenue, all coming together. And this is a highly regulated environment too, just like the sprawl is heavily regulated with separate zoning. But here you have a common setback. The street is 50 feet of pavement with a 8-foot sidewalk, and retail on the first floor with apartments or offices above, depending on which plumbing code you want to deal with. But it's your choice. And only one moving lane in each direction. And these streets carry 30,000 cars a day. There's only one moving lane in each direction. And there's parking all day, even at rush hour, because the merchants need the parking. If the merchants don't have legal parking on these streets, then people won't come and drive. In Chicago, there's a lot of pedestrians too, but they need the drivers as well. It's not that they'll actually get the spot that's in front of the store they want to go to, but they'll have the illusion that they'll get that spot and they'll drive there and then park down the street or parking back on the lot. But anyway, so the merchants won the battle. They went to the aldermen and kept the parking restrictions away. They had more clout, as they say in Chicago, than the traffic engineers. And so this is a very prosperous street. If you go there on a Thursday night, it's just packed. The restaurants are packed. It's just incredible prosperity, and the real estate values there haven't dropped like they have in so many other places in the country recently. Another street like that is Dundas Street in Chinatown in Toronto. One moving lane in each direction, and the streetcar shares it with the traffic. And then parking all day, even at rush hour. And retail on the first floor and on the second floor too, in some cases. Very, very vibrant street, but it's congested. And remember, we talked about the DOTs and the federal government wanting to just have the road have one purpose and not the other purposes. And that's because the idea was to defeat congestion. The congestion was the problem and needed to be defeated. But it's not just vehicles that congest on Dundas Street in Toronto. There's other congestion. There's lots of people, and there's lots of money, and there's lots of excitement. So it has excitement congestion. It has all these different congestions. And so the goal, the very goal of American transportation policy has been wrong. It's been the wrong goal. not just the wrong actions. Now, getting back to that, the streets like Damon, this is what in Milwaukee called Kinnikinnick, which means winding snake in Potawatomi. That was the Indian tribe that the Europeans marched out of the town in 1836. But at least they had a street name with one of their words. But anyway, this is what traffic engineers, they didn't have traffic engineers in 1925, let's say, but they had civil engineers. And if they'd gone to Texas A&M, they would have learned this street, the two-rod street. That's the standard format for a commercial street. So you'd have two rods from the center lane to the building line, 50 feet pavement, and then a 7-foot sidewalk on each side. Retail on the first floor, apartments above. And this street, just look how the wide variety of human activity. Hardware store, there's a leather clothing store, there's a bowling alley, there's several taverns, it's Milwaukee after all. There's a liquor store right here. And after you go to all those places, you can go down the street and go to the Catholic Church and confess. All on the same street. In fact, on the other side of the street, there's a Lutheran church. So there you can just walk in. You don't even have to confess. All you have to do is declare your faith. By faith and faith alone shall ye be saved. And so this is a very good, think of that now. In the newer areas around Houston, is there any place where a church is on the same block with something else? Or where it's into the urban fabric? I mean, it's in the museum district. I mean, in the older parts of town, or the older parts of Boston or San Antonio, or whatever, you can find it. But in the new parts, there's just a church can't be built. It has to be built in like a stadium with a giant parking lot around it. You know, the phrase in the Bible, walk humbly with your Lord. I mean, I think that's sort of been lost a little bit over time. Anyway, I'm getting off into religion here. I don't want to go too far with it. My father was a Presbyterian minister, but he's dead now, so I can talk about religion. Now, the separate use zoning, what it did really was make this form illegal. So you had the retail on the first floor, in this case a restaurant, and then also in this case the restaurateur was right above. And so this became illegal with the separate use zoning. But it wasn't just the separate use zoning. All kinds of regulations affected this kind of building. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which is often under attack now because they haven't done so well in the last recession and have this advantage in the marketplace with the guarantee behind it. But Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the mortgage companies, they have a requirement that in order to get a mortgage, a house mortgage, in the secondary mortgage market, in the case of Fannie Mae, no more than 20% of the building can be non-residential. So that means if you have a mortgage on the apartment above, it won't get into the mortgage market set by Fannie or Freddie. And then all the other banks tend to mimic them. So one of the reasons that you don't see downtown Des Moines, or what is the big street in Austin where, is that Main Street? Or Congress Street. It would never be built new anywhere because if you put housing on it, it wouldn't qualify for Freddie or Fannie unless it was really high. Because, you know, like in New York, it's fine because they do 37-story building on the Upper East Side, and retail on the first 1 or 2 floors. That's not going to violate the rule. But it doesn't violate the rule where you have a lower-rise street. So these regulatory forms have had the effect of depressing and prohibiting urbanism. And it got so bad in the 1950s and 60s where they started to want to widen all the existing streets. And this street in Milwaukee is 54 feet wide. It wasn't wide enough. it had to be 72 feet wide, so they put a non-conforming use restriction on all the buildings. So the street that's 3.5 miles long with millions and millions and millions of dollars of property value, all of which were made non-conforming uses. So if somebody bought one of these buildings, the title search that's done by the title company would find that it was a non-conforming use, and then it would make it hard to borrow money and rebuild the building or refurbish the building. And so these streets would literally rot. And that was kind of the idea. So that the buildings would die off, and then you'd set back the new buildings, and then widen the street to 72 feet eventually. That was the idea. So we were actually regulating streets in a way where we just were destroying the property value in cities. But now that in Milwaukee we changed that. So now when there was a fire, the building was lost there. So the new building came in. And the developer, without having to get a variance, without having to hire a lawyer and all that, just pulled the permits and was able to put the building up right away as of right. Or another thing that has had a horrible effect on urbanism is off-street parking regulations, which there should be no regulation on parking off-street, requiring parking off-street. It's a very foolish thing that actually works against the interests of people that think it's going to help them. You'll get a neighborhood and somebody will want to put up an apartment building and they'll fight the apartment. Don't put that in here. And if you do put it in here, you better put a lot of parking in it so they don't park on our streets and compete with us. But the problem with that is the more parking you put in that building, the more cars people are going to own that are in that building. And during the daytime, they're not going to park in the building. They're going to park in the street because it's more convenient for them. And so the very purpose of trying to free up the parking in the street is not going to work. What does work is parking on the street. So if you have a street and you allow parking along the street, that'll be used very well. But anyway, so in Milwaukee, of course, we experimented with all the bad ideas. And one of them was on this lot, which was empty until this construction started, 19-foot frontage. And it had a requirement for 7 parking spots. So you would have to go up 3.5 floors. The lot was only deep enough for 2 spots. So you go up 3.5 floors, taller than the buildings around it. And then you can finally build something on top of that if you to meet the ordinance. So nothing was built. That lot was empty for like 25, 30 years. And then when we repealed the law and just said there is no regulation, the property owner could do what they wanted, not do anything they wanted. They had to build the building to fit the lot, and the setback was set and so forth. But they couldn't, they didn't have to do the parking. And this nice building was put in there, added value to the other buildings around it. The missing tooth was put back. And now it's starting to happen, you know, even in Atlanta, which is, along with Houston, one of the cities most associated with sprawl. In Atlantic Station, they're starting to build buildings that fit the more urban form. And they were able to get around the Fannie Mae Freddie Mac law by counting buildings throughout the entire project, so that some of the towers that were there allowed them to get Fannie Freddie access. And urbanism is starting to be embraced by the retailers. And if a code is right, in this case Chicago's code, the Lincoln Park neighborhood, which is about as close to a form-based code as you can get in Chicago, because there's a lot of people there that were watching everything. And Home Depot went in and built their building. There's no visible parking. There's some under the building, access through the alley. And there's meters in front. And a nice 2-story building right on the street, showing that even Home Depot, which has made their money off the sprawl form, can figure out how to do it right if they really want to. And they did want to. But this is what we typically do. This building takes care of the drainage issue, and it answers the question, if you're visiting this building, you know where to park. It's a big parking lot. no questions there. But let's say you ask yourself another question, like, where am I going to go to lunch? I'd like to walk to lunch today. Well, you can walk around the path around the pond, and then go back into the vending machine area within the building. Eat your lunch that way. I suppose I'd be walking to lunch. But look at all the infrastructure that has to be built to support a building like that. All these big highways, just so they can be there. It all really seems foolish. But and there are people that self-criticize on this stuff, like Cisco Corporation. This is their campus. And they have a lot of employees who have to travel a long distance to get to their work because of the crazy housing market in Santa Clara County, California. And so they were sensitive to that, and they also realized that their campus was ugly. I mean, a lot of the people at Cisco work in Europe and have visited and seen, places that were, and plus they have San Francisco nearby, so they wanted to be more urban. So this is what they're doing. They're lining the parking lot with condos and apartments and giving their employees first shot at them. But you can see that, with the office parks around Houston, if you wanted to retrofit sprawl, you could actually do it. There might be even better, if you take even more parking away, you can start putting blocks into this area and making smaller blocks, which is also important for walking. But there is hope. It's not just that sprawl is, oh, what a horrible mistake, it's all going to die. Some of us may want it to die. But there's people living or working in those places, so you really do want to make it better, not just mock it and laugh at it. And so here's a sincere effort that Cisco's making to change, that hopefully will catch on. And there's lots of opportunities in the Houston metropolitan area to try this technique. Or Pasadena, California, where on the gold mine train, really piling up housing around the station. So there's a lot of people. Instead of what transit operators usually do is, well, we've got to have a lot of places for people to drive to so they can get on our train. And so they'll build big parking lots all around the train. Maybe have a 7-Eleven off way on the side somewhere where you can buy a bottle of soda pop. But in this case, in Pasadena, they're taking advantage of the train so that the people who live there, and this project really sold out quickly. It's very vibrant, and there's another one, the next stop down also has a high-density TOD, transfer development. Now I want to talk to you about urbanism and the modernists. And the modernists did things that can make your jaw drop with awe, like Corbusier helped do the UN building in New York, which I think is a handsome building, and the Ronchamp Chapel or whatever. There's examples of things, individual projects that he did, but his attitude towards cities was not very good. He talked about killing the street, and this was his drawing in 1922. Now I bring this up because a lot of times people think that sprawl is somehow an expression of the free market. And I already pointed out it's not. You get the road regulations, movement only, or vehicle movement only. And you've got the separate use zoning, which is an intrusion by the heavy hand of government. But we have this sort of myth that somehow sprawl is what the market is doing, and anything else would be intrusion. But actually, Corbusier was very active in his thinking. He wanted to kill the street. He was offended by it. He felt that pedestrians needed to get out of the way of the cars, so you just don't have pedestrians, you put them somewhere else. And so he did this drawing. If you look at it closely, you can see the cars of the kind you see in 1922. And it was built all over, particularly in America, more in America than anywhere else. This is Crystal City near the Reagan Airport in Washington, D.C. It's actually in Virginia, and this is the Jefferson Davis Highway, which you couldn't have a Jefferson Davis Highway in the District of Columbia. That wouldn't make it through the council anymore. But anyway, the Jefferson Davis Highway is completely separated from the built environment, which is high density, but desolate and sterile. And so there's actually a train line, the blue line and the yellow line goes underneath it. And this is all being retrofitted by a new urbanist, John Torty, who David knows, from Silver Spring, Maryland. And they're going to turn this into a real street and retrofit it. And here's Corbusier. And his ideas are very, very seductive. You know, he was probably the first, most iconic architect. And, you know, if you go to the Harvard campus, the School of Design, you'll see students with glasses just like trying to pick up the feeling of Corbusier. And this is what he wanted, this vertical expression in the Jewish quarter on the right bank of the Seine, with this, all the streets made grade separated, with towers in the park. And the Parisians were horrified by this and rejected it, and so they didn't build it. And it would have destroyed what today is billions and billions of dollars worth of real estate value. But, you know, they did build it on the edge of Paris. These are the Picasso Banlieue, you know, the towers. And there were riots here, the Algerian immigrants and so forth. There's something about these towers in the park that just don't work. They look great as drawings. Pruitt-Igoe, which the great Japanese architect, Suko, I forget, maybe I'm pronouncing it wrong. But anyway, he in '55 he did Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis, and 20 years later it was torn down. But it still keeps happening because it's such a seductive idea, and it looks good on paper. These aren't upside down perfume bottles. This is the barracks for or dormitories for the 2012 Olympics that would have been in New York if New York had won the Olympics. You know, maybe Chicago will win the Olympics on Friday. We'll find out. I have mixed feelings. As a taxpayer in the city of Chicago, I have mixed feelings about that. I have a feeling it will be drawing cash on the market. But anyway, Zaha Hadid did this. She's one of the most prominent star architects today. But, you know, it's already been proven not to work as an urban form when it keeps coming back. And here's the other great modernist, the great leader of the modernist movement, Walter Gropius, who was a German from Berlin, and he headed up the Bauhaus movement. And he was a big part of the modernist medium after World War I. And World War I was such a horrible war. It was unnecessary. Most historians say it was unnecessary. And it was mechanized killing with the machine gun, the tanks and airplanes and so forth. So it was the first time people had experienced that mass murder so quickly. And so the imperial, the empires were guilty as charged. And their architecture then was stigmatized by that war. And Gropius really led that effort. He felt that the forms of the Beaux-Arts and the forms of the German imperial architecture and the English whatever, that they were all an abomination and it should be the end of history. And the new forms, where form follows function, as Mies van der Rohe said, that should be it. And he went on to, with Corbusier, and formed the Congress International Architecture Moderne, Scion. And that's why I think it's the Congress for the New Urbanism. We lifted that name from them because, in a way, it's not that New Urbanism is juxtaposed against all modernism, but against the destruction of urban form that modernism carried out, at least the brand that came from Corbusier and Gropius. Now there was another modernism which is much more common in Europe, Otto Wagner in the Austrian school, and that is a modernism that retained the urban forms. But anyway, Gropius took over the architecture school at Harvard. He became the dean, and for about 20 years, from 1937 until the mid-50s, he was in charge and completely changed their curriculum, which had been a Beaux-Arts influenced curriculum, and which was fine, you know, build glass and steel buildings. I wouldn't have any problem with that. But he eliminated a lot of urban forms. He taught against them. Like he said, don't terminate the vista on the street. Don't do this. Now this is Port Washington, a little village in Wisconsin, 29 miles north of Milwaukee on Lake Michigan. And the St. Mary's Church lines up perfectly with the center lane of the street. And this scene was built out in the 1880s, 90s. They didn't really have an architect or planner or record, but they used a pattern book from the Austrian Empire, which still existed then, for Krakow. And if you look at the main street in Krakow, the church, St. Mary's, the same name, lines up perfectly with the center lane and the ordinary buildings on each side, with the monumental building turned on its axis a little bit. In this case, it faces out over the lake. And that's a nice technique. But it wasn't the empire of Europe that invented that form. It goes back to the Romans and the Greeks and the Persians, even the Aztecs, the Incas. They all used that. But, you know, it really, Gropius really had a thing about that. And so he put it in the curriculum. He did that with a lot of forms. And so these things disappeared because Harvard has such a strong presence in the architecture community. And so for about 40, 50 years after World War II, no terminated vistas were built in America. You look around. It's almost, you can't find them. It was such a powerful message that had gotten through the system, except for two places. And one of them is this one. Orlando, Florida. The other one's in Anaheim. Because Walt Disney, who had some design training, and mostly it was a drafts person, but he was trained and he could draw. And he understood form, and so he put Sleeping Beauty's castle with the ordinary buildings on each side with the retail on the first floor, and Mickey and Minnie living above. Nowadays, Goofy and Pluto living together. You know, all of it. Wonderful place. So, you know, you look at this form. This is from Italy. You know, built in the 15th or 16th century in a northern hilltown of Italy. The campanile of the church and the ordinary buildings on each side. What's wrong with that? Why does that have to be a problem? Or this building built very naturally, you know, without a lot of fuss. Beautiful building, LaSalle Street in Chicago, the Chicago Board of Trade lining up on the top. You can't see it very well because the lady of the harvest, you know, and they always say if the market gets bad enough, she'll dive off. But I go out of my way. Well, our office is over on Dearborn, 2 blocks over the traveling. But I'll go out of my way when I'm going south. To go over to LaSalle and just walk down the street. It's so beautiful to see this building terminating vista. And it adds to the real estate value of all the buildings on the street. But it was wiped out. You can't do that. It was just strange. Or in 17th century Holland, when they were so rich, they had bid up the price of tulips and all that stuff. But they were the most powerful trading country in the world then. So they had a lot of money, and they built this beautiful church on the end of the canal. So if they could do that in the 17th century, why can't we do it today? And the answer is we can't. It's happening. See? Target. It's on the end of the street. Very ordinary buildings. You have a Dunkin' Donuts here with a parking lot above, and a Starbucks and a big box bookstore, and then Target, and right around the corner, Kohl's. This is in a mall that was scraped. The Washingtonian Mall in Gaithersburg, Maryland was scraped to the ground because malls are failing, nobody's building new malls. If a mall doesn't have really serious competition, it'll do fine until it does. But the mall form seems to have receded. Although the tweeners like malls, there's a market there. The 9, 10, 11, 12, 13-year-old group, which actually has some money to spend, they like malls. But anyway, so you've got this form returning. I mean, the H almost lines up with the center lane of the street. You've almost got it right. But it's the developers doing it. It's not the architects, it's not the, and that's actually kind of, I think that's kind of cool myself, because it means that it is being driven by the market. Because Target insists now, when these lifestyle centers are built, or village centers, towns, they're struggling to come up with the right name for these things. But whenever they build them and Target's there, they demand to be there on the terminated vista, so their name can be right there. These big box stores, when the malls were first starting, they always wanted to be at a certain spot in the mall. But now they want to be there. So it's sort of the return of this form. And in Milwaukee, I'm proud to say, we actually had a public building that terminated the vista. That was because Calatrava, Santiago Calatrava, who's a star architect, but he's also an urbanist. And he, without any prompting, he put his building in that spot. He didn't buy in. He's more of a Wagnerian modernist, not a Gropius modernist. Now, another modernist that, you know, has some nice things about him, you could say. He's a very kind person, Oscar Niemeyer. But, you know, seeing as we're in Texas, I have to point out to you that he's a communist, a card-carrying communist. He really is a communist. He's about 101 years old now. This is an old picture. But he actually donated his fees and did the design for the French Communist Party headquarters in Paris. And it's not that bad a building. I don't have a picture of it today. But if you go to Paris, you should take the time to go see it. It looks like a great building, maybe the best building in a Dallas corporate executive park, plopped right in the middle of Paris. But Paris is so cool that it actually works. Now, if you had two buildings like that, it would be ruined. But it actually works. But anyway, not to get into that too much. But, you know, for those of you that run into the Chamber of Commerce types or the Kiwanis Club or whatever, they say, oh, this new urbanism and environmental or smart growth, there's a bunch of socialists and stuff. No. Sprawl. You've got Corbusier, you've got Gropius, and you've got Oscar Niemeyer. Oscar Niemeyer built the most sprawled out city in the world, Brasilia, the capital of Brazil. This is it. And it's got towers that are separated, no sidewalks next to the street. The street is only for traffic. And this is what he's created. And nobody wants to be in this city. All the good restaurants are in the shadow, in the shanty towns around the edge of. They say if you want a good meal in Brasilia, you have to go to Rio or to one of the slums outside Brasilia, because the city is so sterilized that all the major streets are all grade separated. You can't walk on them. You know, they've created this sterile place. Communist place. And I'm on a committee, by the way, in Texas. I'm on the Texas Context-Sensitive Streets Commission, which the Texas Highway Commission, whatever it's called, set up. Scott Polikoff is a planner from Dallas. He's chair of it. Mike Cruzy, who used to be in the legislature, Republican, he's on it too. But anyway, you know, I mean, I show this stuff to the people at Texas DOT. I mean, you know, is this really what you guys want to do? And I was afraid they were going to say, you're goddamn right, that's what we want. But this is the, and before I said the two-rod street, you know, with 50 feet of pavement and 7-foot sidewalk. That's what they learned in engineering school. Well, now, what they learn in engineering school, if you were building an arterial street out on the edge in new development, it would be 72-foot arterial with 20-foot medians, so you can do the pork chop double turn lane, left turn lane at the intersection. And then you'd push all the buildings away from the road 100 feet or more, so you can widen the road later. And you don't bother with a sidewalk. Those people don't matter. They can walk in the dirt. Or, alternatively, they can walk in the gutter. You know, either way. But imagine, you know, when you hear people say that the Americans have love for the automobile. Okay, if this is the choice you have, you can be a criminal suspect walking in the gutter, or you can be a law-abiding American and be in one of these cars or trucks. Better get a truck. You know, I mean, that's the choice we give people. So it's not something they're picking. And look where the highest real estate values are in the United States. New York and San Francisco, a place where there's tons of transit and sidewalks and, you know, walkable cities. That's where all the big real estate, if you want real estate value per square mile, you want to see really good value, it's where there's transit and sidewalks. But this is what we spend all the money. Over half the money spent on pavement in America goes to this one form, the big, great separated expressway. Over half. And it doesn't add value. If it did add value, then the places that are covered with it would have more value, but they don't. Detroit has lots of freeways. Didn't work as far as adding value. It did work in terms of eliminating congestion. They don't have that. But and then the freeways were built, there was a scam, you know, we're building the defense highways. We're not building them just to build them. We're building them for defense. We're going to save America with these highways. And so the idea was that, you know, if the Soviets launched, you'd be able to jump on these things and get out of it. No problem. So we had a trial run when Rita came to Houston. It doesn't work. Everybody tries to use the same road and it doesn't work. And if the bomb, if the Soviets had launched, well, anyway, probably shouldn't have put that in there. There is that movie, you know, that was on TV the other day, the Independence Day, which has a bad end for Houston, right? I don't know if you've ever seen it. You know that movie? Anybody seen it? Yeah. Yeah. Not a good movie for Houston. Anyway, I want you to guess what city this is. Anybody want to take a shot? Yes.
Detroit.
Detroit, you're correct. And this is Woodward Avenue, and the picture was taken in the spring of 1946, right after the war. And they had streetcars. They had over 300 miles of streetcars. They had about 200 miles of interurban trains. And they had big sidewalks that were packed with people. There were 3 department stores on the street, Kearns, Crowley's, and Hudson's, which was the biggest department store in America except for Macy's. So, you know, Detroit won World War II. I mean, it was the most productive city in the world in producing war material. Not only supplied the United States, supplied the British, supplied the Australians, the Russians, our allies, the Soviet Union. A lot of the stuff they got, it was taken by our ships up to Murmansk and to Vladivostok, was made right here in Detroit. So the most productive, most successful city in World War II. And then after the war, they started spending money tearing it apart. A lot of money. And they built these things. The idea was to fight congestion, destroy congestion. And they won that battle. They didn't have congestion anymore. That's the Hudson's department store. 30-some years later, it came down. This is Berlin in May of 1945, right at the end of the war. They lost. Germany lost World War II. Just to bring it up to date. About in the city proper part itself, about 70% of the buildings were either destroyed or weakened so much they had to be razed. This was where the Red Army and the Nazi Army, the Wehrmacht, fought it out those last 3 weeks right at the end of the war. And they just blew the place apart. And this is Potsdamer Platz today. It's like Times Square. That's the wall went right through there. There was nothing there but the wall. And now it looks like Times Square. So if you didn't know anything about World War II, you know, where did it happen? What was the epicenter of the damage from World War II? Was it in Berlin or was it in Detroit? It looks like it was in Detroit because about 30% of the building sites that had buildings on them back in 1946 at the end of the war. They're now empty. This is Detroit. It's the most productive city in the world from 1941 to 1945, and it has pheasant today. Now, that is a failure of public policy, a really bad public policy, just decanting these cities and ripping them apart. And they did succeed in their goal of reducing congestion. They do not have congestion. It's the least of the problems in Detroit. And it happened a lot of places in Milwaukee. We defeated 3 of the expressways. I was part of that movement back in the 70s. We defeated them, and they only built about half of them. But they did get the main business district in the black community in Milwaukee, Walnut Street. That's how it looked after it was improved by the highway department. They just wiped it out. And it's so unpleasant being next to these things, they have to put up these sound walls. The steel reinforced concrete, which is the best material if you want to reflect sound. The wooden panels look better. I have a lot of experience with this from Milwaukee. But the concrete really works. It's the only surviving technology of the old East German Republic. You can see if you go to San Antonio, Texas, you can see examples. You know, I was thinking Eric Honecker came back to life, the last important leader of East Germany, and he went to San Antonio. You can feel right at home. This is Martin Luther King Drive. And this is a perfect example of the movement only, vehicle movement only, and the social and economic purpose of the road is forgotten. Now the car industry knows better, so they don't usually use this ad. You know, they don't show this, although once in a while there'll be a quirky one that does do something like that. But they'll go in the woods, or they'll go in the city. In this case, Charles Bridge in Prague, the Czech Republic. And the Charles Bridge, by the way, does not meet any American highway standards. It doesn't meet Federal Highway Administration standards, TxDOT standards, none of those standards. None of the bridges in Prague do. Just imagine what we could do to Prague. You know, it's the most successful city of all the former Warsaw Pact ones. It's the richest city. It has the most, you know, British and French business people, Americans living there near Wenceslas Square. They bid up the price of all the apartments. And they have, but we could change that. You know, we could go in there and just run a freeway through Wenceslas Square and be all set. Now, the idea of the road, you know, the first freeways were built in Germany, actually even before the Nazis. It'd be convenient for me to say that the Nazis had invented the Autobahn, but actually, the first one was started to be built in 1929 when there was still a government that was civilized in Germany. But they built it, even the Nazis didn't build them in the cities, they just built them between the cities. It was in the U.S. that this was experimented with, and this was Robert Moses's Lower Manhattan Expressway, which would have gone through if it had been built from the Manhattan Bridge to Holland Tunnel through Greenwich Village, Soho, and Tribeca. And it would have wrecked Soho, which is, you know, the property values in Soho, that's at least $2 or $3 billion just there. That would have been wrecked. But these things don't last. They fall down after about 40, 50 years. Their design life is about 40, 50 years. So there's a great opportunity in the United States right now to change things. It started in '73. The West Side Highway in New York City fell down about 40 years after they built it. And there it is in its ruin. And now it was replaced with a street. And it's just a street along the west side of Manhattan, lower Manhattan. And it opened up views of the river again. And the real estate values went way up. Chelsea, Tribeca, Battery Park. All this real estate revival happened just by eliminating the road. And the traffic, by the way, just disappeared into the grid. It wasn't a problem at all. And the same thing in San Francisco with the Embarcadero, which was built in 1950, over the objections, by the way, of Caspar Weinberger, who was the liberal Republican assemblyman from the northeastern corner of San Francisco. And demographics have changed a lot. Back then, it was more of an Italian neighborhood, and they were Jewish neighborhood as well. But the Italians were Republican because the Irish were Democrats. And so they elected Caspar Weinberger, who was kind of a silk-stocking liberal Republican, and later on became Reagan's defense secretary, much more conservative as he got older. But I ran into him in 1990, the year after the Embarcadero fell down in New York City, at a meeting. And we were talking about it, and he said, you know, I was the assemblyman there, and I opposed it. And those hippies had just died. They knew I was the original opponent. I said, that's so cool. So anyway, the hippies would have loved it, though, if he'd been DOT secretary instead of defense secretary. So anyway, it's gone now. It's back just like it was. They had a streetcar line on it back before 1950. In fact, there's an Orson Welles movie where the climactic scene, the person jumps on the streetcar in front of the canal, in front of the terminal. They have a Market Street and go down to Chinatown on the streetcar. You know, you could do that movie again now because it's all been restored. The real estate values came back. Everything's been fine. In Milwaukee, without an earthquake, we tore this freeway down. Look at the impact it had. You had car parking instead of buildings, and cars looking out over the river throughout the day because of this freeway. Now that's all being filled in with on streets and with nice buildings. But the most dramatic transformation of the city, and one that people really ought to become familiar with, and I think Houston maybe could relate better to this city than to try to relate to San Francisco or New York. I mean, let's be realistic. So, Seoul, South Korea. At the end of the Korean War, with our help, they built this freeway right through the middle of Seoul, and they covered the river, which is the main river that goes through Seoul. And then in 2001, Young Bak Lee was elected mayor. And he had long wanted, he was a conservative too, by the way. He had long wanted to bring the river back. And he also didn't think the freeway was necessary. So they eliminated the freeway. There's just 2 moving lanes on each side of the bridge. And there's no problem with it. The traffic just disappeared into the grid. It distributes better than it did before. I mean, the problem with the freeway was that it would carry you beyond where you wanted to go, and then you'd have to go back. So it actually distributes better without it. And billions of dollars in real estate. They act quickly. The whole project was done by 2003, and now that's how it looks. And here, look at how happy he is. That's the mayor. That's what happens when a mayor actually does the right thing. You know, when they have the courage to stick their neck out and really do something, you can get that kind of feeling. And now he's president of South Korea. He's probably not quite as happy because that's a really, really tough job, especially when North Korea is sitting there with 45,000 artillery pieces aimed at Seoul at any moment. But anyway, and this phenomenon is spreading, and it's the reason I focus on this. It's such a dramatic correction to the thinking of the post-war period. This is in Seattle, the freeway built in 1951, Alaskan Viaduct. Yeah, it was called Alaskan because it was sort of on the way to Alaska. If you were on the south side of Seattle, you get on this and you're on your way to Alaska. But anyway, it blocks the waterfront. And, you know, that's how it looks. So we actually got involved in that. The Pioneer Square Business Association and the Waterfront Coalition, which included business people, environmental people. And we met with the governor to try to persuade her, and she didn't quite buy our argument right away. She said, well, what would we do with the traffic? I said, well, the traffic will go away. Well, that's not good enough. Well, the traffic, the truck traffic, it's almost all deliveries. Over 90% of it was deliveries in and out of downtown. They don't need the freeway. They can just go on the streets, pick out the street they want to get and go. They don't need a freeway to do it. But anyway, so we talked to her, and she said, well, I just can't imagine a big city functioning without a road. I said, well, you got Vancouver. No, it's less than 200 miles north. How about Vancouver? They don't have one. They don't have any freeway in the whole place. It's got the most buoyant real estate market in North America. You know, if you've ever been there, it's a rich city. It's dripping with money. No freeways whatsoever. So maybe they're suffering. So why don't we give them? Let's put the Alaskan Viaduct there, or here's a close-up. Would it be a better place? Would life get better? You know, they probably have less congestion of money and people and all kinds of stuff. Or Portland, they tore out a freeway that was along this stretch in 1973. Let's put it back.
Yeah.
You know, or other stuff that pushes. So if you have a city, you know, like Vancouver, which is on a very tight grid, you can't. If you have a regulation, you can't have a lane wider than 9 feet 10 inches or 3 meters, because they know that big lanes create fast driving and degrade the real estate. But you can't do that. You've got to spend your money on these big roads. That's what the federal government will pay for. Well, that needs to change. And that's something CNU is really pushing hard on. We want to change that so that if cities want to enhance their street grids and create choices on how people travel and choices on which streets they want to use, that should be rewarded and not punished. And you can see it with Washington, D.C., the beautiful street grid done by Pierre Lafont. And Connecticut Avenue, which is a big boulevard, it's where DuPont Circle is. But most of the street is connected to the grid. So if traffic congests, you can get off and go to roughly parallel another street like Mass Ave or Wisconsin Avenue or whatever. But if you get on the Whitehurst Freeway, which runs out of Georgetown, it congests. And at rush hour, it's 2 to 6 miles an hour in Whitehurst, whereas it's 8 to 13 miles an hour at peak of rush hour on Connecticut Avenue. So the freeway works great at 2 in the morning. When you don't need it, it works. But when you need it the most, it doesn't work so well. So anyway, I'm getting to the end here in case you're getting nervous about when it's going to end. This is the book we're working on with the Institute, the Institute of Transportation Engineers, ITE. They're a very traditional group. Brian Bachner, some of you may know him from the Texas Transportation Institute at Texas A&M. He's been the lead writer of this thing. And what it does is try to re-legitimize the boulevard, the avenue, the street, and change the regulations when streets are in urban context. So those streets can get federal money or state money, not just the ones that rip the city apart. And we're also working with the fire people, you know, we have a lot of developers who, new urbanist developers, they want to build narrow streets, and the fire marshal says you can't do it, you need 20-foot clear. And with parking, that becomes 36-foot residential street, which is ridiculous. And we get all angry with them, but then we decided to meet with them instead. And so we've been talking to them, and we found out that fire marshals and fire experts love grids because they have redundancy. You can go down the street, there's a blockage, you can go over to the next street and get to the fire and put it out. And so we have that in common. So, you know, later this month, we're going to be in front of the International Fire Code Council, and one of the leading fire marshals in the country, or a guy from Austin, Texas, is going to present our case, and we're going to try to get flexibility on 20-foot clear if you have sufficient connectivity. And it's a big breakthrough. And so that's what new urbanists do. If we see a problem, we try to solve it. We move around. If we can't solve it here, we solve it from another direction. And so that we can have streets that aren't so outsized. And we want to save the earth, but that's not the only reason we're urbanists. There's a whole cascade of benefits. It's not just the efficiency of people living closer together on a walkable city where you have transit. We all know, we understand that's good for the environment, but it's also good for living. It makes more efficient living. You save energy, you save money. It makes it a better place for social activity, cultural activity. So there's lots of benefits. So when Al Gore talks about the inconvenient truth, I say urbanism is the convenient remedy. Because you don't have to invent some new fuel, you know, fusion cars, or you know, something that's not going to mean anything. You can cut down, if new development in Houston was on street grids with just a little tighter development pattern, you know, maybe 7 units per acre instead of 5, we would save a lot of energy. And life wouldn't be that bad. Some of the coolest neighborhoods you have in Houston are 12 units per acre or more. So, you know, it's not like some terrible thing. But unfortunately, Al Gore doesn't mention land use anymore. And the next time I see him, I'm going to give him a hard time. Because in the year 2000, when he ran for president, his advisors told him not to talk about it because it's some suburbanite could be kicked off if he said anything bad about sprawl. So he stopped talking about it. But he's not running for anything now. We ought to start talking about it again. Another thing we're doing at CNU is working with the Green Building people. Now, the Green Building Council has its LEED program. So LEED buildings, like in Crawford, the president, former President Bush, to his credit, his building is LEED certified silver. And so it doesn't use as much energy. Thank you, George W. Bush. But HSBC Bank moved their headquarters from a close-in suburb in Chicago that was right near a Metra commuter rail line, and they put it way out where it wasn't anywhere near any transit, near these cows, and they got a gold rating from LEED for the building because the materials and energy usage and the HVAC was good and all this stuff. But all their employees had to go out and buy cars. So the whole point of it was blown out by the fact that they left town. So we went to the Green Building people along with NRDC and other environmentally oriented group. And we said, hey, this isn't right. And so they agreed, and that's why we're doing this LEED ND, LEED Neighborhood Development, which sometime later this year it should finally come out in the market. And it will reward proximity. If you did a gold building in an older neighborhood in Houston, you'd get a platinum. You do a platinum building way out in the middle of nowhere, you're going to get downgraded to gold or silver. So, you know, it'll have a powerful impact. Okay, and if you want to, my book is available in all the various electronic book purveyors like Borders and all that. If you want to read more of my deep thoughts about all kinds of stuff, it's in its third printing. So that's supposed to be good, I guess. And if you want to, we have a meeting coming up November 4 through 6 in Portland, Oregon, with Oregon, as they say there. And it's, 120, 140 of the most exciting traffic engineers that you'll ever meet. These people are really motivated, excited. There's other people that come, there's non-traffic engineers who show up too. But, if you're interested in that, go to our website, CNU.org, and our annual meeting is coming up in Atlanta, May 19th through 22. And that'll be exciting because it's going to be all about health. And the CDC is our co-partner with that event. And they truly believe that settlement paths have a lot to do with the decline in health statistics, particularly for children in the United States. And they're looking to us to back up their bald assertions with facts. So we're working on that. So anyway, thank you very much, and I'll be glad to answer any questions that anybody might have. Yes. Yeah, there's been the question was, I didn't talk about the town square, and there's been a deterioration of that idea. There has. The green space, we don't call them town squares or parks, and now we've come up with this horrible word, green space. I'm going to go with my child and play in the space. It's just, any of you ever heard of S.I. Hayakawa? He was the right-wing senator that was appointed by Reagan to be a senator from California. He was pro-Vietnam War. That's how most people know. But he actually did something really good. He wrote a book, he was a linguist. He wrote a book, Semantics. And he wrote a book, and he had this word ladder, which later became the Hayakawa word ladder, and how human beings have this tendency to go to the more vague term. This is a finger, it's a digit, it's part of the body, it's an object. You can see where this goes. And this deterioration of the language has affected the way we look at green space. So we now have this vague idea of green space. So a freeway interchange has green space, but it's unusable. No, but what makes the Boston Common good is the building line that surrounds it. It encloses it and makes it valuable. It's setting. And there are details about it I like, its simplicity and the swan boats, things like that. But a really great park is determined by its surroundings. And the art of landscape, I'm an honorary member of the American Society of Landscape Architects, so I have deep respect for them. But landscape architecture really deteriorated in this post-war period. And suddenly, the idea of building a park just became something that was a lost art. It was the loss of connection to the things around it. So if you're in an urban setting, you need buildings around that park. Now, if you're out in the countryside, make a state park, or a national park, wilderness, whatever. But this idea that somehow it's just space, and I think that's part of the problem. It's a lost art. It's a simple art. It's easy to do. New urbanist projects tend to have the space enclosed properly, and people need to learn how to do that again. That's one of the urban techniques and skills that needs to be restored. Okay, anybody else have anything? Yeah.
You talked about the new ITE, context-sensitive design guidelines, and you
Yes.
talked about the work you're doing with TxDOT in Texas. Can you tell us anything about what might come in this direction with federal transportation reauthorization?
Well, I'll try to tie them together. I think TxDOT may actually end up produce something even better than the national one, because the people from Texas DOT that have been involved in it so far, they really seem to be into it and doing change, which is, you know, been a pleasant surprise so far. Now, they haven't published anything yet, and they'll be looking at what we turn out. I'm on both groups, so I've got some say over that and responsibility if one is screwed up. But I think in terms of T for the ICE-T reauthorization, CNU, and unfortunately so far pretty much by ourselves, we're trying to get this networks idea into the authorization bill. You know, there's been this traditional battle between where the environmentalists and others on one side trying to have more transit, and then you've got the road building lobby on the other side saying roads. And they reached sort of the battle lines finally stopped at 80-20. And it's been that way from the first ICE-T, second, third, now the fourth ICE-T. You know, 80-20 is the number, and now the T for America coalition is trying to move that from 20 to 25 and 30. But that's not the only issue. Even if they win, all that money that's spent on roads, why does it have to go for crappy stuff? I mean, I met with Peter Ruan, the executive director of the American Road Transportation Builders Association, which is he's the leader of the highway line. I met with him and I said, look, every sidewalk, every alley, every beautiful lane, every great street like Michigan Avenue in Chicago or Fifth Avenue in New York, every one of those was built by a road contractor. You guys need to embrace the stuff that's really cool and beautiful that people like, and not just be for the stuff that people don't like. They're always complaining that nobody will raise the gas tax. Well, part of the reason they won't raise the gas tax is because everything they want to build is so butt ugly. Why would you want to raise the gas tax? So they should be for boulevards and avenues and streets. These are all things that they could make money off of. So we're trying to get them to understand that. I don't know if we'll win. T4 keeps getting delayed, and it'll continue to be delayed because they don't have a funding source for it. And, you know, nobody wants to say they're for a tax anymore. And even though the gas from an economic standpoint, you know, economists usually don't get elected to office, but especially if you talk like an economist. But if the best tax to raise is probably the gas tax in terms of and consumption taxes generally are good for them. Democrats tend to oppose it, and Republicans tend to oppose it for different reasons. But they don't have a tax, so if they're ever going to have one, so there keeps being more time for us to win. That's the one good thing. And we really want to I'm trying to get the T for America coalition, which is all the environmental groups, and try to get them to buy into this. Because we're going to spend all this money on roads, let's spend it on roads that actually add value. Let's just look at raw real estate value. It ought to add value. You know, forget about the environment for a minute. Forget about being nice to other people or any of the other things that people want to say. Just look at value alone. And building these giant things doesn't work. If it did, Detroit would be the richest city in America.
What's the relationship between urbanism and planning and zoning? A lot of what you talk about is, changing the way highways are built.
Well, urbanism would include planning and zoning as a major issue. So when I say separate use zoning, in New Urbanists would juxtapose that with form-based coding, which basically means you regulate the building size and placement. So you'd have, like on the two-rod street I described, the 7 or 8 foot sidewalk and the building like that. So you're regulating the distance from the street, the size of the street, the envelope of the building, and then that leads to a more urban product, or could, if it's done right. And then you look at separate use zoning and makes that possible. So that's an element. Urbanism is a big general topic, and then zoning and coding and other things like that are within planning. Now, planning could be good, it could be bad. You can plan, planners can build something really beautiful, like the L'Enfant's plan for Washington, D.C., or Oscar Niemeyer's hideous plan for Brasilia. It's like engineers. Engineers can build the Taj Mahal, or they can build a concentration camp. You know, planning by itself is just a word.
If you proposed a new urbanism for Houston, where would you start? What freeway system would you tear down? Give us you ever thought about that?
Well, probably the one that people here would be the most familiar with, that I think is really right for it, that would make a huge difference, would be to tear down the Claiborne Expressway in New Orleans, which was built on top of the boulevard, Claiborne Boulevard, which is a beautiful boulevard. Louis Armstrong lived along it. It was sort of the upper middle class African Creole street. Tremendous value, elegant homes and apartments and stores, and it was just ruined when they put I-10. Now I-10, it sounds like, oh, how could I ever get to Florida with I-10? But when you go, assuming you'd want to go there, but if you're going from Houston east, you don't go on I-10 anyway. You're on I-10 as soon as you get to New Orleans. You go on 610 because 610 goes straight, but I-10 goes into New Orleans and back out again. So it's really out of the way. There's no reason for it to be there as a freeway. Boulevard would be just fine. So that's one that we're working with local groups there. It's called the Treme District. And that's one where I think it would have an immediate, huge positive impact on New Orleans if that was taken out. You know, the people that fought freeways in New Orleans 40, 50 years ago, one of them was a guy named Bill Moore, and he led the fight against the Vieux Carré Expressway, which would have gone right in front of the French Quarter along the river. Can you imagine? So when you were at St. Louis Cathedral, in the square there, Jackson Square, there'd be this huge roar from the freeway, just this loud noise constantly. That's what they wanted to do. And then if it had been built and somebody wanted to take it out, they said, well, that's impractical. What are you going to do for traffic? You know, it's not impractical. It wasn't built, so you don't need it. No one would want to do it today. Well, the same thing's true with the Claiborne. There's no reason to have it there. The traffic would distribute better there.
The structure in Houston is entirely different because of the frontage roads that we have. And in Texas, that is the policy of Texas Michigan. And that seems to me to be a real unholy analogy between the land development and the side. The seeping movement is supporting the highway. Based on those frontage roads. That seems to me that the real issue here in Texas. Other cities do not have frontage roads. And they do not have all those problems.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. The question was about, Texas has freeways, and typically in the urban condition has frontage roads next to the freeway. Actually, a lot of places have frontage roads next to the freeway, but yours are bigger and more prominent and more deliberately done. I mean, in most places, it's just a street that's left over on each side as opposed to deliberately built frontage road. But really, a frontage road is just another form of the outer lanes of a multi-lane boulevard. And, Texas has a lot of big highways, and it's a culture built around the highways and all that stuff. So I'm not saying you could change it quickly, but the change can come incrementally. For example, in Dallas, they don't need to build a freeway through that river corridor. A boulevard would function much better from the traffic standpoint, and it wouldn't degrade I know Santiago, Calatrava wants to do all these bridges, but they're not going to look very good with a big freeway running through that river corridor. So in the future, they can learn from this. A multi-way boulevard would be much more appropriate and less expensive. That's Texas DOT starting to understand that they can't spend as much money as they'd like, so they need to change the form. So I'd say there's hope for Texas. There's not hope for undoing the entire freeway system probably during our lifetimes. But, you know, the ideas are changing, and it's on the increment that I think it actually could have a big impact in Texas. Yeah.
This new bill,
Livable communities.
I just happened to see something about it today on
Yeah, there's,
it seems to have.
it's $140 million that will be handed out to cities for things that help
It seems to be
cities.
a step in the right direction here.
It needs definition. You know, it's well intended, but almost everything the federal government's done that has to do with cities is well intended. But then it needs definition. So it's really the administrative rules that guide how that money. Now, the person who was head of CNU before I became executive director, Shelley Patricia, is in the position in HUD that will deal with the HUD portion of that program. And hopefully she'll get the right things in place to make it work. Yeah, and back there.
I was interested in that picture that you showed of the fire truck. That fire truck looks about a third of the size of the fire truck that's in vogue now, at least in this part of the world.
Yeah, that was a French fire truck.
And that
Or maybe it was Japanese, I forgot.
The fire truck drives, in most communities, drives the width of the street. It drives the number of access points to the development. I mean, it's just like, there's no other choice. When the fire marshal or the fire chief says this is what we got to have, and the fire code that you adopt has all these, you know.
Well, I mean, the idea is on a residential street, you need to build it big enough so two fire trucks can pass each other without the mirrors breaking.
Exactly.
But
Which is
actually, they don't need to pass each other. That's a very unusual occurrence where they actually need to do that. If there's a major street, you can make that argument, but I think on residential streets, our point is just that you could go to 16-foot clear, and for, you know, almost everything you can imagine, that would work as long as you have connectivity, as long as you have a grid, so there's some redundancy. And the other thing that they would like to include in that is sprinklers. If you had sprinklers, then they're willing to go to narrower streets. The fire trucks are big, not just because the fire truck companies want to sell big fire trucks, although I'm sure they do. But when I was mayor of Milwaukee, I became involved in the fire truck purchasing business. And I mean, I had to be involved in that. You leave it just to the firefighters, the money gets out of hand. But anyway, the fire trucks are actually not 10 feet wide. Because they kept telling me that, and they took out a tape. We actually measured it. The fire trucks we had, which were E1, which we switched to different Pierce fire trucks later, they were 9 feet 6 inches, no, 9 feet 8 inches. And so you actually could have two of them pass and they wouldn't break the mirror. But the interesting thing with the firefighters that got them to think more in our favor on this was, if you look at, for example, there's 4 times as many firefighters killed going to emergencies than in fires. And there's about, 4,500, 4,700 fire deaths a year in the United States, and there's over, about 50,000 traffic deaths. And so if you build all the streets real big so the fire trucks can move, and then you end up with more pedestrian accidents. Like no pedestrian has ever survived a crash of 37 miles or more in speed. That's sort of the upper limit of where anybody survived. You get down below 27, and about half survive. And you get down to like 2 miles an hour, and you're almost guaranteed you're going to survive even 5 miles an hour. You're not going to get killed. And so speed really matters. And if you regulate the roads so that they're going, if the posted speed is 45 miles an hour, well, any pedestrian that's hit by a car legally going 45 miles an hour is going to kill a pedestrian. So the firefighters look at that, and you look at total life factor, not just fire death factor. You know, then they care about that. Now, on the other hand, there's nothing worse for a firefighter than to walk into a building and take out a dead kid. And I saw one of those in Milwaukee. It's a horrible thing. The dead kid smells like bacon. It's a sickly smell. It's just, it's tragic. And firefighters can't stand it, so it's understandable, you know, that they want to be able to get to a fire quickly. But they also are reasonable. They're thinking, you know, redundancy with the grid and sprinkling and other ways to deal with it and still have streets that aren't, you know, blown out. And so I think we're getting someplace with that.
Thanks, John.
And I'm on the campaign staff for Councilmember Brown.
Which I'm going to be here. Thanks very much. Don't forget, a month from now, Andres 20, probably right here. Agricultural urbanism.
Oh, and wait till you see his agricultural transit. You'll go right home and plant a huge garden in your window.